When the HOA declared my backyard community land, I knew I had to draw the line, literally. So I electrified it. What began as a fight for privacy escalated into an all-out war with my neighbors, the HOA, and even the local government. But I wasn't backing down. After all, it's my property, right? The letter arrived on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, tucked neatly into my mailbox like any other piece of mundane correspondence. At first glance, I assumed it was another reminder about trash collection schedules or an invitation to a neighborhood gathering I had no interest in attending. But as I skimmed through the first few lines, my stomach tightened. The words on the page didn't make sense. The Homeowners Association had unilaterally decided that my backyard, my carefully cultivated sanctuary, was now to be designated as community land for the betterment of the neighborhood. I reread the letter, certain that I must have misunderstood, but the meaning remained painfully clear. My private property, the place I had spent years turning into a personal oasis, was no longer considered mine alone. The HOA wanted to repurpose it into a shared green space for the entire community to enjoy. I could practically hear the smug self-satisfaction behind the letter's carefully worded phrasing. They had dressed it up in the language of unity and progress, but there was no mistaking what was really happening here. My land was being taken from me, and I wasn't even given the courtesy of a discussion. There had been no meeting, no vote, no request for my input, just a declaration, an edict handed down as if I had no say in the matter. I stepped onto my back porch and surveyed the garden I had built with my own hands. Vibrant flower beds stretched along the wooden fence, their colors vivid in the afternoon sun. A stone path wound through rows of neatly trimmed hedges, leading to the small koi pond I had installed years ago. A wooden bench sat beneath a towering oak tree, its shade offering a cool, peaceful retreat on hot summer days. Every inch of this space had been shaped by my labor, my vision, my time. And now it was supposed to be handed over to anyone who wanted to trample through it? Frustration simmered into anger. The idea of strangers treating my backyard like a public park, letting their kids run wild through my garden, lounging on my patio as if they belonged there, it was infuriating. More than that, it was insulting. I went inside and grabbed the HOA bylaws from my filing cabinet, flipping through the thick stack of pages in search of anything that could explain this outrageous overreach. Most of the text was the usual bureaucratic nonsense, rules about lawn maintenance, acceptable paint colors, and mailbox uniformity. But buried deep in the legalese, I found a vague, ambiguous clause about community improvement projects and the potential reassignment of underutilized private spaces for the greater benefit of residents. Underutilized? My backyard was not some abandoned lot or neglected stretch of land. It was a well-loved, well-maintained garden that I used every single day. And yet, because it happened to be appealing, because it was beautiful and inviting, the HOA had decided they were entitled to it. I clenched the letter in my fist. If they thought I would just roll over and accept this, they were in for a surprise. The HOA meetings were usually dull affairs filled with discussions about landscaping guidelines and parking regulations. But that night, the room crackled with tension. I arrived early, determined to get a seat at the front where I could make my objections impossible to ignore. As I walked in, I noticed the familiar faces of my neighbors, some murmuring in hushed tones, others glancing at me with a mix of curiosity and unease. News of the HOA's sudden claim over my backyard had clearly spread, and I wasn't the only one eager to see how this would play out. The board members sat in their usual spots at the long table, a row of smug expressions that only fueled my irritation. At the center was the HOA president, Mr. Richard Langley, a man who had somehow convinced himself that running a neighborhood association made him the equivalent of a small-town mayor. His sharp suit and neatly combed silver hair gave him an air of authority, but I saw right through it. He was a bureaucrat playing king, and tonight I was here to knock him off his throne. When the floor opened for resident concerns, I wasted no time standing. I want to discuss the letter I received about my backyard being turned into community land. My voice was calm, but the fire inside me burned hot. Langley barely reacted. "Ah, yes, we expected you might have questions." He folded his hands on the table as if he were about to explain a minor inconvenience rather than a blatant land grab. This isn't a question, I shot back. It's a statement. My property is mine, and you have no right to take it. A murmur spread through the audience, but Langley remained infuriatingly composed. We're not taking anything, he said smoothly. We're simply repurposing an underutilized space for the good of the community. It's all within the guidelines outlined in the HOA bylaws. I had anticipated this argument. I've read the bylaws, I said, holding up a printed copy. And this so-called clause you're using is vague at best and completely overreaching at worst. You can't just decide my land belongs to the neighborhood because you like the way it looks. Langley's expression barely shifted. The board has already voted on the matter. It's been approved. My grip tightened on the pages in my hand. You voted on it without me, the property owner, even being present? Another board member, a wiry woman named Karen Holloway, chimed in. We're simply looking out for the best interests of the neighborhood. The best interests of the neighborhood? I repeated, incredulous. Since when does that include stealing private property? Langley sighed, as if I were a stubborn child refusing to accept bedtime. If you truly feel this strongly, you're welcome to appeal the decision. And who hears the appeal? I asked, already knowing the answer. The HOA board, of course. I let out a sharp laugh. It was a rigged game, and they knew it. The board members exchanged looks, already convinced they had won, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. I leaned forward, locking eyes with Langley. If you think I'm just going to roll over and let this happen, you're making a big mistake. I walked out of that meeting with a new resolve. If they wanted to take what was mine, they'd have to fight for it, and I was more than ready for battle. The decision was made the moment I walked out of that HOA meeting. They wanted a fight. They were going to get one. If they thought they could steal my land with some obscure bylaw and a smug attitude, they had another thing coming. They had claimed my backyard was community land, but I was about to make it the most unwelcoming piece of property they had ever seen. The first step was research. I spent the next few days combing through local regulations on property modifications. I wasn't about to give the HOA any legitimate reason to claim I was breaking rules. I pored over height restrictions, boundary laws, and even electrical fencing ordinances. I made notes, double-checked sources, and finally, confirmed my plan. As long as I followed the exact legal guidelines, they couldn't touch me. The installation process began early Saturday morning. A team of contractors arrived with materials stacked high on their truck bed, steel posts, insulated wiring, and a control panel that would ensure everything functioned perfectly. I watched from my porch as they measured the perimeter of my backyard, marking the spots where the fence would go up. Neighbors began to gather almost immediately. Some stood in their driveways, arms crossed, whispering to one another. Others strolled by with their dogs, slowing their pace to get a better look. It didn't take long before someone finally worked up the nerve to approach me. "What exactly are you doing?" asked Jim, a guy from down the street who I barely knew, but who had suddenly taken an interest in my property. "Protecting what's mine," I replied, arms crossed. He let out a small, nervous laugh. "An electric fence? Don't you think that's a bit extreme?" "Not as extreme as trying to steal someone's backyard." I met his gaze, unflinching. He had nothing more to say after that. By midday, the steel posts were in place, and the first strands of electrified wiring were being strung between them. The air hummed with tension, both from the live wires and the growing unease of my so-called neighbors. The HOA must have gotten wind of what I was doing, because, by the afternoon, Karen Holloway showed up, her face red with barely contained fury. "This is unacceptable," she fumed. "You can't just put up an electric fence in a residential neighborhood." "Actually, I can." I pulled out a printed copy of the county's fencing regulations. As long as it meets the legal height and voltage requirements, it's perfectly within my rights. She snatched the papers from my hand, scanning them with narrowed eyes. "This is insane," she muttered. "You're turning your backyard into a fortress." "I'm turning my backyard into mine again," I corrected. Maybe if the HOA had actually asked for permission before declaring it community land, we wouldn't be in this situation. By sunset, the work was complete. A sturdy, perfectly legal electric fence now surrounded my backyard, sending a clear message to anyone who thought they could trespass. That night, I sat on my back porch, looking at my garden with a satisfied smirk. The HOA had tried to take what was mine, but I had drawn the line. Literally, the war had begun, and I had just made my first move. I woke up the next morning to chaos. My phone was buzzing nonstop with messages from neighbors, missed calls from unknown numbers, and even a few voicemails that I didn't bother listening to. The neighborhood group chat, one I usually ignored, was flooded with furious messages about my newly installed electric fence. Words like dangerous, reckless, and selfish popped up repeatedly. It was clear that my little act of defiance had thrown the entire community into an uproar. Then came the news crew. I heard them before I saw them. The unmistakable murmur of reporters setting up, the beeping of a camera being adjusted, and the hushed voices of eager journalists preparing their segments. I stepped outside to see two news vans parked on the street, a small crowd of nosy neighbors already gathering around. A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a microphone clutched in her hand turned toward me the moment I emerged. "There he is," someone whispered. The reporter's face lit up with the kind of excitement only controversy could bring. She strode toward me, microphone raised. "Sir, are you the homeowner who installed the electrified fence?" I crossed my arms. "That would be me." She smiled as if she had just caught a rare animal in the wild. "Your actions have caused quite a stir in the neighborhood. Many residents are saying this is an extreme and dangerous measure. How do you respond?" I glanced at the small crowd, many of whom were HOA loyalists who had no doubt fueled this media circus. I refused to let them control the narrative. I'd say it's dangerous to assume you can take someone's private property without consequences. The reporter's smile twitched slightly, but she recovered quickly. "The HOA claims that your backyard was designated as community land for the benefit of all residents. Do you believe your response is proportional to their decision?" I took a step forward, making sure I was looking directly into the camera. "Let me ask you something. If I walked into your house, sat on your couch, and declared your living room to be a community space, would you be okay with that? Or would you do everything in your power to stop me?" The reporter hesitated. A few murmurs rose from the crowd. I pressed on. "The HOA tried to take my backyard without permission. They didn't ask. They didn't negotiate. They just decided it wasn't mine anymore. If that's not theft, I don't know what is. So yeah, I put up a fence to protect my property, and I made sure it was one they couldn't ignore." A man in the crowd scoffed. "You're making this neighborhood look ridiculous." I turned toward him. "No, the HOA made this neighborhood look ridiculous the moment they thought they could claim private property like it was a free buffet." The news segment aired that evening. The headline read, "Electrified Fence Sparks HOA War." Within hours, the internet had taken notice. My story was shared across social media, debated in comment sections, and even turned into memes. Some people called me a hero, standing up against HOA tyranny. Others called me an unhinged lunatic with a vendetta. The HOA had wanted to use public pressure to force me to back down. Instead, they had turned me into something much bigger than just a stubborn homeowner. I had become the face of a movement, one I had no intention of walking away from. The lawsuit came faster than I expected. A thick envelope arrived in my mailbox, stamped with official seals and heavy with legal documents. The HOA had made good on their threats, claiming I was violating community rules, endangering residents, and creating an unsafe and hostile environment. I had expected pushback, but taking me to court over my own backyard? That was a level of audacity I almost had to respect. Almost. I wasn't intimidated. If anything, I was more determined than ever. The media attention had transformed this into more than just a petty neighborhood dispute. It had become a battle over property rights, and I had no intention of losing. The day of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Melissa Carter. She had seen the news coverage and agreed to take my case with the same fire I felt burning in my chest. The moment we stepped into the courtroom, I spotted Richard Langley sitting smugly at the HOA's table, flanked by his legal team. He barely looked at me, as if I was already defeated. The proceedings began, and the HOA wasted no time painting me as a reckless, selfish homeowner who had turned my property into a dangerous war zone. Their lawyer droned on about how the electric fence was a hazard, how it created division in the neighborhood, and how I had refused to compromise. Then Melissa stood up. She didn't just defend me. She went on the attack. She laid out every single way the HOA had overstepped its bounds, from their unilateral decision to claim my land to their complete lack of due process. She pointed out that the bylaws were vague and, more importantly, did not actually give them the power to seize private property. She methodically dismantled their argument, piece by piece, until even the judge seemed annoyed with Langley's side. But the best moment came when she presented the petition. During the media frenzy, hundreds of people across the country had signed an online petition supporting me, condemning HOAs for their overreach and abuse of power. Melissa submitted it as evidence, not because it had any direct legal bearing, but because it demonstrated public sentiment. The courtroom murmured as the number of signatures was read aloud. Langley shifted uncomfortably for the first time. The judge called for a recess before delivering the verdict. I stepped outside the courtroom, taking a deep breath. The weight of everything, the battle, the stress, the sheer absurdity of fighting for something that should never have been taken from me, hung over me. Finally, we were called back in. The judge ruled in my favor. The HOA had overstepped. Their claim was invalid, their actions unjustified. My backyard was mine, and the electric fence, since it met all legal requirements, would stay. They had no legal grounds to force me to remove it. Langley's face was priceless, his confidence shattered in an instant. The board had lost, and there was nothing they could do about it. I walked out of that courtroom victorious, but the battle had changed me. I had started this fight just wanting to protect what was mine. But now I understood something bigger. Sometimes you have to take a stand, not just for yourself, but to remind those in power that they can't take what they want without a fight. And if that message had to be delivered with an electrified fence, so be it.